The wind scraped against the cabin walls like a beast trying to claw its way inside. Snow hissed through the cracks in the old wood, and somewhere beyond the porch, something moved. Clara froze, cup of tea halfway to her lips. For weeks the nights had been silent. Only the ticking stove, only her own breathing. But tonight, she heard it again. That sound. Soft, deliberate, the crunch of paws pressing into snow. She set the cup down and reached for the lantern. The flame flickered as she opened the door, and cold air rushed in, biting her skin. The world outside was silver and endless, the kind of silence that makes your heartbeat sound too loud. And then she saw it. A small shape crouched beside the woodpile, fur clumped with frost and blood, eyes glowing faintly in the lantern's light. A bobcat, thin, ragged, starving. For a moment neither of them moved. Only the snow fell between them, whispering. It licked at the frozen ground, where scraps of food had fallen earlier that day. Clara remembered tossing the leftovers there, not thinking. Now the creature devoured them like it hadn't eaten in days. She could have closed the door. She almost did. But something in those eyes stopped her. That strange mix of defiance and fear, the wildness still unbroken. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured. The bobcat looked up. Its breath shimmered in the light, slow and shallow. Then, as if understanding, it stepped back into the dark and vanished into the falling snow. Clara stayed at the doorway long after it was gone, her lantern shaking slightly in her hand. The cold bit through her robe, but she didn't move. The silence that returned felt different now. Not empty, but expectant. The next night, it came again, and the next. Always at the same hour, just beyond the porch light, waiting. She started leaving food out, just a little, pretending it was nothing, pretending she didn't care. But she did. Each night, the distance between them grew smaller. It no longer fled when she stepped outside. Sometimes it watched her from the shadows, unblinking. Then one evening, after a heavy storm, she woke to find the world buried under a fresh layer of snow. The porch was untouched. No paw prints. No movement. Something tightened in her chest. She waited. An hour. 2. Still nothing. The night stretched on, vast and hollow. For the first time in years, she realized she wasn't afraid of the dark, only of its silence. At dawn, she stepped outside, her boots sinking deep into the snow. The air was sharp, clean, too still. Then she saw it. A faint smear of red cutting across the white, disappearing into the trees. Clara raised her lantern higher, heart pounding. There, just visible beneath the storm's breath, were paw prints. Small, uneven, leading away from her house. And without thinking, she followed. Mornings in the cabin came without sound. No birds, no creaking floors above, just the sigh of wind sliding through the pine trees. Clara woke to that sound every day, and every day it felt the same. Quiet, predictable, almost kind in its stillness. She kept the place as she always had. The kettle on the stove, the chipped mug by the window, the faded flannel hanging on the chair. Everything stayed where it was the day she stopped taking pictures. Once, she had been good at it, capturing the fleeting, the almost unseen. Her photographs of wildlife had hung in small-town galleries and ranger stations across the northern states. People called her work intimate, though Clara never thought of it that way. She just waited. She watched. She learned when to breathe and when not to. But after the accident, after the river and the thin ice and her son's bright red coat sinking beneath it, she couldn't lift the camera again. It felt like stealing from something sacred, like pointing a lens at a wound. The world outside her window kept moving. Seasons folded into one another, quiet and indifferent. And Clara, too, folded in, shrinking to fit inside her silence. She spoke only to herself, or sometimes to the empty air. She didn't answer letters from the old photography magazine that still mailed her Christmas cards. She hadn't been to town in months. The people there had stopped asking about her long ago. Her days were measured by small rituals: feeding the stove, mending socks, sweeping snow off the porch, though no one ever came. And at night, she would sit by the window, lantern dimmed low, watching the trees turn to silhouettes. That was before the Bobcat. Now, when darkness fell, she found herself waiting for the flicker of movement near the edge of the yard, for those eyes that seemed to know something she didn't. She never said it out loud, but the truth pressed against her chest like a secret. It felt good not to be invisible anymore. Beyond the cabin, the forest stretched for miles, an endless maze of snow and silence. The trees leaned with age, their trunks half buried, their branches sharp as ribs. Every sound traveled far here. A snapped twig could echo like a gunshot. When Clara stepped outside, she always listened first. The air itself carried stories: the groan of ice shifting on the river, the faint rustle of something unseen. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the north, she swore she could hear voices, children laughing, faint and distant, like an old memory refusing to fade. There were animal tracks, too: deer, fox, occasionally something larger. She followed them with the same careful attention she once gave to light and framing. It was all she had left of her craft: learning to see. Her cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, where the pines opened to a frozen lake. On calm days, the ice reflected the world like a mirror. On stormy nights, it moaned and cracked, as if something beneath was trying to rise. The townsfolk rarely came this far anymore. They said the winter had gotten meaner, that the forest had its own moods now. But Clara had stopped believing in the cruelty of nature. What frightened her more was how quiet the human world had become. Sometimes, when she went out to split firewood, she'd find strange signs: a half-eaten hare near the shed, paw prints circling her compost bin, a low growl carried on the wind. The first time she saw them, she thought of wolves, but the spacing was too small, the claws too sharp. A bobcat, maybe. She remembered thinking it must be starving to wander so close to people. That night, she left a few scraps by the porch. Not out of pity, she told herself, but curiosity. Yet when she heard the faint crunch of snow and saw the creature emerge from the shadows, thin and trembling but proud, something inside her shifted. Since then, the forest didn't feel so empty. The nights didn't stretch as long. And for the first time in years, Clara began to look out the window not to remember the past, but to see what might come next. Still, somewhere deep down, a quiet fear coiled beneath her calm. She knew the wild gave nothing freely, and she wondered, why had it chosen her? The storm came down like an uninvited guest, sudden and merciless. By the time the last light drained from the sky, snow was already clawing at the windows, thick and fast, the way it used to on the worst nights in the north. The wind howled across the clearing, carrying with it the hollow cry of trees bending under ice. Clara added another log to the fire. Sparks leapt, died, and fell into the glow. She wrapped her blanket tighter, trying to read by the wavering lamplight, but the words refused to stay still. Her eyes kept sliding toward the door. The bobcat hadn't come tonight. For weeks it had appeared without fail, silent as breath, steady as ritual. But now, with the storm raging, the porch lay empty. She told herself that was normal. Wild things knew when to hide. Still, an unease spread through her chest like cold water. Outside, the world dissolved into white. She tried to focus on the sound of the fire, on the pages turning, on anything but the wind. Then it came, faint at first, almost swallowed by the storm. A sound that wasn't wind, a cry. She froze, set the book down, listened again. There, sharp, broken, and close, the kind of sound that came from pain. Clara's body moved before her mind caught up. She grabbed her lantern, yanked on her coat, and stepped into the blizzard. The cold hit like a wall. The first breath stabbed her lungs. She raised the lantern high, its light carving a trembling tunnel through the snow. The storm swallowed everything else. Her footprints vanished behind her seconds after she made them. Then she saw it, a dark shape near the edge of the trees, small, slumped, barely moving. She trudged forward, boots sinking deep. When she knelt beside it, her heart twisted. It was the bobcat, fur matted with blood, sides rising in shallow gasps. One of its legs was caught in a metal snare, half buried beneath ice. "Oh God," she whispered. The animal tried to pull away but couldn't. The chain rattled, sharp against the storm's moan. Clara hesitated. It was madness, to touch something wild, injured, and terrified. But the sight of the snare, that cruel rusted loop biting into flesh, made her throat tighten. She knelt lower, voice trembling. "Easy now. It's all right." The bobcat growled weakly, eyes flicking toward her. For an instant she thought it might strike. Instead, it went still, trembling violently. She took hold of the snare, fingers burning from the cold. The latch was frozen solid. She pressed until the metal cut her palm, and with a sudden snap, the trap gave way. The bobcat jerked free, stumbled, then bolted into the white. Only blood and paw prints remained, leading into the dark. Clara stayed on her knees, snow clinging to her lashes. Her pulse hammered in her ears. For the first time in years, she wasn't numb. She was alive. By the time Clara stumbled back to the cabin, her hands were shaking so hard she nearly dropped the lantern. Snow clung to her coat, melted into her hair, slid down her neck like ice water. She slammed the door against the wind and leaned there for a moment, chest heaving. The fire had died low. She added wood, peeled off her gloves. Her fingers were raw and burning where the snare had cut them. She poured hot water into a mug just to feel the heat seep back into her bones. Outside, the storm still screamed. Yet beneath it, faint, rhythmic, she thought she heard something else. A sound like scratching. She frowned, set the mug down. The noise came again, not from the walls, but from the door. Clara lifted the lantern, heart thudding, and unlatched it. The door swung open with a gust of snow. There, hunched on the porch, was the bobcat. It was smaller than she remembered, its fur stiff and glistening with frost. Blood had soaked through the band of fur around its leg, dark against the pale snow. Its eyes, half-lidded, blinked slowly up at her. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The wind howled through the clearing, scattering powder around them. "You came back," she whispered. The words left her mouth before she realized she'd said them. The bobcat swayed, tried to step forward, then collapsed. Something inside Clara lurched, the same sharp, helpless panic she'd felt the day the river took her son. She crouched beside it. "It's all right," she said softly. as if her voice could hold the storm at bay. "You're safe now." She fetched an old blanket, spread it on the floor by the hearth, and went back for the animal. It was heavier than she expected, limp but warm. She carried it inside, careful not to touch the injured leg, and laid it on the blanket. Steam rose as the heat from the fire began to melt the snow off its fur. She knelt there, watching its sides rise and fall, shallow but steady. The air filled with the smell of wet fur and smoke. Clara's heartbeat slowed, matching the rhythm of the crackling fire. She found herself speaking quietly, words she hadn't used in years. "You'll rest here tonight. Just tonight." The bobcat didn't stir. It simply breathed, a soft, rasping sound that somehow steadied her. Clara sat beside it until the lantern burned low, until the storm outside faded into a hush. Her eyelids grew heavy, but she didn't move. When she woke at dawn, light poured through the window like liquid silver. The storm was gone. The world outside was new, smooth, untouched, and the bobcat was still there, curled close to the fire, asleep. Clara stared at it for a long moment. She could have felt fear. She could have felt regret. But what she felt, unexpectedly, was a strange kind of peace. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and wet fur. Clara opened the windows to let in the morning light, careful not to wake the creature curled near the hearth. The bobcat slept deeply, its sides rising in slow, uneven breaths. Every once in a while its tail twitched, as if chasing something in a dream. She moved quietly through the room. The snow outside glared white against the window panes, throwing soft reflections across the floorboards. For the first time in months, the cabin didn't feel like a tomb. There was movement again, a pulse, a presence. When she brought water to the fire, the bobcat stirred, its head lifted, eyes narrow and watchful. Clara froze mid-step. She expected it to bolt, but it only blinked, dazed and weak. "Easy," she whispered. "It's just me." Her voice sounded strange in the silence, low, careful, almost gentle. She set the bowl down, close enough for it to reach, and stepped back. The bobcat sniffed the air, then drank, its tongue flicking quick and silent. The wound looked cleaner that morning. She'd cut the ragged fur around it and wrapped it in strips torn from an old shirt. Her hands had trembled the whole time, but the animal hadn't fought her. It had only watched, golden eyes flickering in the firelight. Days passed in that fragile rhythm. Clara moved around the cabin with deliberate slowness, never rushing, never making sudden sounds. The bobcat began to rise more often, padding softly across the floorboards, limping a little less each day. Sometimes, when the snow piled high outside and the wind howled through the eaves, she'd talk. Not to it exactly, but near it. About small things. The weather, the river, the way the frost formed perfect feathers on the glass. "You'd think I'd be used to the cold by now," she said one night, stirring the stew. "But it still surprises me. Every year." The bobcat lay stretched before the fire, tail curled around its paws. It didn't respond, but its ears turned toward her voice. She smiled faintly. "You listen better than most people I've known." The quiet. Her words sounded both foolish and necessary. She'd spent years hiding from sound, from memories, from conversation, from the echo of her own loss. But now, with this wild, silent creature breathing beside her, she found herself craving noise, even small noises, even her own. By the end of the week, the bobcat could stand without limping. It prowled the corners of the cabin, sniffing at the door, the walls, the boots by the stove. When she caught it looking out the window, something like longing shimmered in its eyes. The same look she'd seen in herself once, when she used to stare at train schedules and wonder where the world went without her. She knew it wouldn't stay. Wild things never did. Still, every evening when she lit the lantern and saw its shadow move across the floor, she couldn't help whispering. A wish, a plea, or maybe a prayer. Just one more night. The first time Clara went to town that winter, the snow had hardened into glass. The tires of her old truck squealed against the ice as she drove down the winding road, the forest pressing close on either side. She hadn't left the cabin in nearly 2 months. The world felt smaller now. The town, the faces, the noise. At the general store, the bell above the door gave a weak jingle as she stepped inside. The air smelled of coffee and kerosene. A few locals stood near the counter, talking in low voices. Conversation faltered when they saw her. "Morning?" Clara offered, pulling her scarf tighter. They nodded, polite but cautious. She could feel their eyes follow her down the aisle, the way small towns always remembered their ghosts. She gathered what she needed: salt, flour, a few cans of soup. At the register, old Mr. Jenkins leaned closer. "Heard a wildcat's been prowling near your place," he said. "Couple of goats gone missing up the ridge. You be careful, Clara." Her hands paused on the counter. "I've seen tracks," she said evenly. "Could be foxes. The snow plays tricks." "Maybe," he said, but his eyes narrowed. "Wouldn't hurt to keep a rifle handy." Outside, she could still feel their stares as she loaded the supplies. The air bit at her skin. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, a church bell tolled, a hollow, distant sound that made her chest ache. The drive home felt longer than usual. The forest seemed heavier, the trees crowding closer as the light dimmed. She caught herself glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see golden eyes reflected there. By the time she reached the cabin, dusk had settled in. Smoke still hung from the chimney, and through the window she saw movement, a flicker of fur near the hearth. Relief washed through her like warmth. Inside, the Bobcat was waiting. It lifted its head when she entered, alert, then relaxed again when it recognized her scent. "They're talking about you," she murmured, setting the groceries down. "They think you're dangerous." The Bobcat blinked, unimpressed. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Maybe they're right." That night, as the wind picked up, Clara sat by the fire with her mug of tea, listening to the steady rhythm of the Bobcat's breathing. She thought of Jenkins's warning, of guns, traps, and suspicion. The world outside her walls had always been ruled by fear, but here, inside, fear had no place. For years she had blamed the wild for taking what she loved. Now she wondered if it had only been trying to give something back. The Bobcat shifted in its sleep, tail twitching, its paw brushed against her boot. The touch was barely there, but it startled her. A reminder that trust, once given, was a fragile, living thing. Outside, the wolves howled somewhere deep in the forest. Inside, she whispered to the quiet, "Let them talk." Winter loosened its grip slowly. The days grew longer, the light softer, and snowmelt dripped from the eaves like a steady clock. The forest began to breathe again. Inside the cabin, the Bobcat had claimed its place. A corner by the fire, the rug by the window, sometimes even the chair when Clara wasn't looking. It moved with quiet confidence now, no longer limping, muscles rolling under its coat like shadowed silk. Clara had stopped pretending it was temporary. She caught herself saving scraps from dinner, setting aside a bowl of water each morning, brushing stray fur from the quilt without complaint. The animal had become part of the rhythm, as natural as the creak of the floorboards or the sigh of the wind through the chimney. But with each day, its eyes seemed to turn more toward the window. Sometimes she'd find it perched on the sill, watching the forest with an intensity that made her chest ache. "You miss it, don't you?" she said once, standing beside it. The reflection of snowlight danced across their faces, woman and creature, both half belonging to the wild outside. It flicked its ears, but didn't turn away. That night, she dreamed of the river again. The same ice, the same scream swallowed by wind. But this time, when she reached through the water, it wasn't her son's small hand she grasped. It was a paw, soft and trembling. She woke with tears freezing on her cheeks. The next morning, she found the door ajar. Snow had drifted inside, scattering white powder across the floor. Her heart kicked hard as she followed the tracks leading away from the porch. Small, light, unmistakable. She didn't call out. Just stood there, staring into the tree line, every nerve screaming between fear and understanding. Maybe this was what love meant, learning how to let something wild go. She went back inside, trying to tell herself it was right, that wild things belonged to the wind. But as she sat by the cold hearth, hours stretching empty, she realized she'd built her world around a sound. Soft pause, slow breathing, the quiet company of something that didn't judge her. Then, as the sky turned violet, she heard it. A soft thud on the porch. She opened the door to find the bobcat sitting there, snow clinging to its whiskers, eyes steady and bright. It walked past her, brushing her leg lightly, almost affection, almost acknowledgement, and settled before the fire. Clara sank to her knees, breath catching somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "You came back," she whispered. The bobcat blinked, tail flicking once, as if to say of course. That night, as the fire burned low, Clara didn't dream of ice. She dreamed of light breaking through snow and the sound of 2 heartbeats, steady in the dark. The thaw came early that year. Streams broke free from the ice, whispering through the woods like secrets being told. The forest smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. Clara felt it too, that restless stirring in her chest, as if something was waiting to happen. The bobcat had grown strong again. Its coat gleamed, thick and golden under the light. It hunted now, slipping out at dusk and returning before dawn, silent and sure-footed. Each time it came back, Clara's relief was sharp, almost painful. She never said anything, just left the door cracked and a bowl by the hearth. That was enough. One evening, a knock startled her. When she opened the door, 2 men stood on the porch, Jenkins and another from the village, faces hard from wind and suspicion. "Evening, Clara," Jenkins said. His eyes shifted past her shoulder, scanning the cabin. "You seen anything unusual out here lately?" She hesitated. "What kind of unusual?" "Tracks, claw marks, something big's been taking livestock near the valley. We're organizing a hunt tomorrow. Thought you'd want to keep your doors shut." Her stomach turned. "You think it's a bobcat?" "Could be," the other man said. "Or worse." His gaze landed on the fur along the rug by the fire, a single tuft of golden hair. His expression tightened. Clara moved subtly, blocking his view. "I'll be careful," she said. They exchanged a look, then nodded and left, boots crunching across the snow. She stood in the doorway long after they disappeared, the twilight sinking into violet and blue. Inside, the bobcat paced near the wall, uneasy ears twitching at every sound. Clara knelt beside it, whispering, "You heard them, didn't you?" It blinked, muscles tense, tail lashing once. There was something in its eyes she hadn't seen before. Not fear, exactly, but awareness, as if it understood. That night she couldn't sleep. Wind rattled the eaves. Every creak of the cabin sounded like footsteps. Around midnight she rose to check the door. The bowl was untouched, the blanket by the fire empty. Her breath caught. She stepped outside, barefoot on the porch. The air was cold enough to burn her skin. The moon lay thin over the snow, casting pale light on the clearing. No movement, no sound. Then she saw them. Prints, fresh and sharp, leading toward the trees. Small at first, then larger, joined by others she didn't recognize. "God, no," she whispered. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and lantern. The flame flared, lighting her path through the darkness. "Come back," she murmured into the wind. "Please, come back." Her voice dissolved into the night, swallowed by the forest. Far off, something howled. Not wolf, not wind, but wild and mournful. She stood frozen, heart pounding in her throat. Somewhere deep in the trees, she thought she saw movement, a flicker of gold, a shadow turning back once before vanishing completely. The sound of the river rose in her ears, though the ice had long since melted. And Clara knew, with a dread as familiar as love, something had begun again. The morning it happened. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no wind, no movement, just the stillness before something breaks. Clara felt it the moment she stepped outside. The air carried that heavy, waiting silence she used to know from years of photographing predators. She scanned the clearing. The snow was crusted over from the night's freeze, glittering with hard light. No paw prints near the porch. No sign of her companion. Her stomach tightened. She walked toward the tree line, boots crunching softly. The woods were a cathedral of frost and shadow. She followed the familiar path down toward the creek, her breath fogging in short bursts. Halfway there, she saw it, a smear of red on the snow. Fresh. Her pulse spiked. She knelt, fingers trembling as she touched it. The blood was warm enough to melt through the crust. A few feet farther, the trail deepened, drops turning to streaks, streaks to splashes. "Please," she whispered, following it. The tracks led her to a clearing where the snow had been trampled flat. Her breath hitched. In the center of it lay a steel trap, jaws clamped shut and smeared with fur. Golden fur. She staggered forward, heart hammering in her throat. The chain was taut, fixed to a stake driven deep into the ice. The smell of iron and blood filled the air. It had happened hours ago. She could tell by the disturbed snow, by the drag marks leading into the trees. The bobcat had fought, hard, and someone had taken it. She sank to her knees, hands clenching in her coat. The world tilted, light and sound narrowing to the echo of metal biting flesh. "No," she gasped. "No, no, no." The forest gave no answer, only the creak of branches overhead, heavy with ice. She picked up a tuft of fur, the same soft gold she'd brushed from her quilt only days before. It clung to her glove, trembling in the wind. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a gunshot cracked, distant but clear. Clara flinched as if struck. Her hand closed around the fur until her knuckles turned white. The villagers' voices returned to her. Their warnings, their whispers, their certainty. "You be careful, Clara. Keep a rifle handy." She rose, the blood rushing in her ears like thunder. Her body moved without thought, driven by something deeper than fear. She followed the drag marks, through the snow, through the silence, into the trees that had always felt like home. Branches whipped her face, tore at her sleeves. Her lantern flickered out, leaving only pale daylight. And then she heard it. Voices, male, rough, close, laughter breaking through the cold. Clara's heart clenched. She moved toward the sound. The voices grew louder as Clara pushed through the last line of trees. Smoke rose from a small camp at the edge of the creek. 3 men, rifles propped against a stump, a truck idling nearby. And there, in the back of the truck bed, was the cage. Steel bars, blood smeared on the floor, and inside, the Bobcat, pressed against the corner, breath ragged, eyes wild and glassy. For a moment, the world tilted sideways. The sound of the river fell away. All she could hear was that breathing, shallow, uneven, desperate. She stepped out of the trees. "Hey!" The men turned, startled. Jenkins was among them. His mouth fell open. "Clara? Christ, what did you do?" Her voice shook. "You caught it. You actually caught it." He frowned, shifting uneasily. "That cat's been killing livestock, Clara. We found the trap near your place. Guess it's been hanging close to your cabin." "It hasn't hurt anyone," she said. It's not what you think." Another man snorted. "You're telling us you know better than a bloody trail of goats? Look at it. Wild as sin. You should be thanking us we didn't shoot it outright." Clara moved closer, ignoring them. The Bobcat lifted its head. Recognition flickered in its eyes, confusion, fear, something deeper. It let out a low, strangled sound, part hiss, part plea. "Let it go," she said. "Can't do that," Jenkins muttered. "We'll take it down to the county warden. They'll deal with it proper." "Deal with it?" she repeated, voice cracking. "You mean kill it?" He didn't answer. His silence was enough. Clara stepped up to the cage, gripping the bars. The Bobcat pressed closer, trembling. Its eyes met hers through the gaps in the steel. There was no anger there, no blame, only a question she couldn't bear to face. "Please," she whispered, "don't do this." The man with the rifle spat into the snow. "You're too close to it, Clara. It's not a pet. It's a damn predator." She turned on him, her face pale but fierce. "So are we." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Only the hiss of the truck's exhaust and the soft panting from inside the cage. Then Jenkins shook his head, tired. "You should go home." She didn't move. He looked away, muttering something to the others. One of them pulled a tarp over the cage, muffling the light, the sound, the eyes, that had once trusted her. Clara stood frozen as the engine roared to life. The truck rolled forward, tires crunching over the snow. Through the gaps in the tarp, she saw a last flicker of gold. Those eyes, locked on her, fading into the distance. When silence returned, Clara realized her hands were bleeding. She hadn't even felt her nails digging into her palms. The snow began to fall again, slow, heavy flakes that erased the tracks before her. And for the first time since the storm, she wished the world would stop being so white. The cabin felt smaller when she came back. The fire had burned out, leaving only the faint smell of ash. She didn't light it again. The silence pressed in like a living thing, heavy and unyielding. Clara sat in the chair by the window, the one she'd used to watch the clearing. Snow drifted outside, soft and endless. The world looked the same, but nothing was. On the rug by the hearth lay a single paw print, faint and melting. She traced it with her finger, and it blurred into nothing. She told herself she should have fought harder, should have grabbed the cage, screamed, begged something. but the truth was she hadn't. When the tarp fell over the bars, she froze, too afraid, too human, and in that frozen second, she'd lost the only thing that had made her feel alive again. She stayed that way for days. The lantern ran out of oil, the water in the bucket froze. She didn't notice. She barely ate. When the wind howled at night, she imagined it was the bobcat's cry echoing through the trees. Then came the knock. It was Jenkins again, hat in hand, standing awkwardly in the cold. His eyes wouldn't quite meet hers. "They took it to the warden," he said quietly. "Didn't last long. Snare wound got infected." Clara stared at him. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. "I just thought you'd want to know," he said, stepping back. "I'm sorry, Clara. Truly." The door closed. The sound of his truck faded into the distance, swallowed by snow. She stood there a long time, the cold crawling up her legs, her hands trembling at her sides. Then, slowly, she reached for her camera. It was still on the shelf, dusty and untouched for years. She turned it over in her hands, a relic from another life. She lifted it, pointed it toward the empty rug, and pressed the shutter. The click echoed like a heartbeat in a coffin. When she developed the photo later, the image was mostly dark, just shadows and the faint outline of the hearth. But in the blur near the edge of the frame, something looked back. Two dim circles of light, soft and uncertain, like eyes remembering her. Clara stared at the photo until the edges wrinkled beneath her fingers. The next morning, she buried the picture beneath a loose floorboard. Some memories were too alive to look at. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and iron. The snow fell harder, heavier, like a shroud over the world. And for the first time since the storm began, Clara whispered into the emptiness. Not a word, just a sound, fragile and raw. It was half prayer, half apology. The wind changed 3 days after the news. It blew from the south, heavy and strange, carrying the scent of smoke that didn't belong to winter. Clara noticed it first at dawn, the frost on her windows melting faster than usual, the air warmer, restless. By noon, the sky had turned a bruised shade of gray. A thin column of smoke climbed from beyond the valley, then another. When the wind shifted, it brought the faint crackle of fire, distant but growing. Wildfires weren't supposed to happen here. Not now. Not when the ground was still white. But the forest had been dry for weeks, the cold brittle and windless, like glass waiting to shatter. Clara stood on her porch, coat drawn tight, staring toward the ridge where the smoke thickened. Each gust carried the acrid scent of burning pine. She should have gone inside, shut the door, waited. Instead, she stayed, motionless, breath clouding in the rising heat. By afternoon, the hills glowed with a dull orange light. The radio in the cabin crackled with warnings. Fire near Mill Creek. Evacuate lowlands immediately. She barely heard it. Her eyes were fixed on the south, where the smoke rolled across the treetops. The same direction as the old creek, the place where they had taken the bobcat. The thought came unbidden. What if it's still there? Her chest tightened. It was absurd, she knew. The animal was gone, dead for weeks. And yet something deep and irrational stirred inside her. The same instinct that had sent her into the storm that night. At dusk, the first trucks appeared on the road below. Sirens wavered, cutting through the wind. Jenkins was among them, shouting over the noise. "Clara, you need to get moving! Fire's crossing the ridge! You hear me? You've got to go now!" She nodded, but didn't move. Her gaze stayed on the forest. the sky above it glowing like an open wound. "I'll be fine," she said quietly. "What?" "Clara." But she'd already turned away. Inside, she packed quickly, her lantern, a blanket, the photograph she'd once buried beneath the floorboards. The house creaked as the wind pressed against it, carrying sparks through the air. When she stepped outside again, the world looked unreal. Snow swirling through smoke, light fractured and red. Each breath hurt now. The air was thick, alive, humming with heat. She walked toward it, one step, then another. The snow hissed under her boots. Branches snapped above her like bones. Still, she didn't stop. When she reached the ridge, the sight stole her breath. Fire rolling down the valley in waves, devouring everything it touched. And somewhere, beyond the roar, came a sound. Faint, sharp, familiar. A cry. Her heart clenched. She took one more step toward the flames, and then another. The forest swallowed her. Smoke rolled through the trees in thick, twisting columns, turning day into dusk. Each breath scorched her lungs. Each step sank deeper into soot and slush. Clara wrapped her scarf over her mouth and pushed forward, her lantern useless in the glare of fire. The woods she once knew were gone. The pines she'd photographed for decades now stood as blackened spears, their bark hissing as sap boiled beneath. Every crack of falling timber sounded like gunfire. She stumbled once, catching herself against a burning trunk, the heat searing through her gloves. The smell of pine and ash filled her nose, sharp, metallic, unbearable. "Please," she coughed into the wind. "Don't let me be too late." Somewhere ahead, a roar rose. Not the steady breath of fire, but something uneven, broken, alive. A cry. She froze, pulse hammering. It wasn't human. It wasn't just wind. "Hello?" Her voice cracked, snatched away by the heat. "Is anyone—" Another cry cut her off. Closer now. Weak, but real. Her heart lurched. "Oh, God." She ran toward it, boots sliding on wet ash. Branches clawed her sleeves. Sparks showered from above like burning rain. She ducked, half blind, half running by instinct. The ground sloped downward toward the old creek bed. Through the smoke, she glimpsed movement, something low, golden, dragging itself through the ash. Her throat closed. No. It was the bobcat. Its fur was singed, one side matted with blood. It limped, favoring the same leg that had once been caught in the snare. Every breath came out as a rasp. For a moment, it didn't see her. It was dragging something behind it, a smaller shape, limp and pale. Clara blinked through the heat haze. A cub. The realization hit her like a blow. It hadn't just survived. It had brought life back with it. She stumbled forward. "Hey! Hey! I'm here! I'm here!" The bobcat's head lifted sharply. Through the blur, their eyes met. The same golden stare that had once watched her through falling snow. Recognition flickered. It let out a low sound, halfway between a growl and a sob. A wall of flame roared to her left, and she ducked as sparks exploded across the ground. The cub squealed softly. Clara dropped her coat, waving it to smother the embers, her hands raw from the heat. "We have to go," she gasped, not sure who she was talking to, herself, the cat, or the fire. The bobcat limped forward, the cub pressed to its chest. Clara knelt, holding out her arms. "Come on, come with me." For a second, the air between them shimmered. Heat, smoke, and something sacred. Then the bobcat moved, closing the space in one staggering leap. It collided against her chest, trembling, alive. Clara wrapped her arms around it and the cub, pulling the blanket over them all. The world burned around her, but for the first time she wasn't afraid. They moved together through the fire. The blanket around them was scorched and smoking, the heat pressing from every side. Clara could barely see more than a few feet ahead, but she felt the weight of life in her arms, the cub trembling against her chest, the mother bobcat limping beside her. Every breath was pain. Smoke clawed down her throat, turned her voice to ash. She coughed, stumbled, rose again. The air shimmered orange and black, flickering with sparks that clung to her sleeves. Just a little further, she rasped. She didn't know where further was, only that stopping meant dying. The bobcat kept pace, though it could barely stand. Each step left a dark print on the scorched snow. Its eyes stayed fixed ahead, unblinking. The cub cried softly, the sound lost under the roar of burning trees. A branch fell behind them, flames scattering. Clara shielded the cub with her body. The bobcat lunged between her and the fire, a low snarl cutting through the chaos. It was small, almost pitiful, but it made something fierce bloom in her chest. She looked at it, really looked. Fur charred, whiskers curled, ribs showing through the smoke. And yet it stood there, defiant, a heartbeat refusing to stop. "Come on," she said, tears streaking soot down her cheeks. "Don't you dare quit on me." They pushed forward together, stumbling through a clearing where the fire had burned hottest. The ground glowed with embers, red and alive. Heat shimmered off the earth in waves. When Clara's boot broke through a patch of molten snow, the pain shot up her leg. She fell to one knee, the cub still in her arms. The bobcat whirled, limping back to her, eyes wide with something that looked almost human. Fear. "I'm okay," she gasped, but she wasn't. Her vision swam. Her limbs felt heavy, the air too thick to breathe. The fire closed in again. Then the bobcat did something she didn't expect. It pressed its head against her shoulder, a gesture of trust, or maybe goodbye, and then turned toward the flames. "Wait! What are you doing?" It lunged forward, vanishing into the smoke. Seconds later, a crash echoed through the blaze, the sound of falling wood, splintering and breaking. When the air cleared just enough, she saw it. The tree that had blocked their path, pushed aside, its trunk cracked and smoldering. And beyond it, open space, a glimpse of snow untouched by fire. The bobcat stumbled out from behind the fallen log, limping badly now. Its fur was glowing faintly with embers, eyes dim but alive. Clara's breath caught. She staggered toward it, clutching the cub. "Come on," she whispered. "We're almost there." Together they climbed the slope, one slow, painful step after another, until the heat began to fade and cold air brushed their faces again. When they reached the ridge, Clara collapsed into the snow, coughing, shaking, sobbing, not from pain, but from relief. The cub whimpered, curling against her chest. She turned her head toward the bobcat. It stood a few feet away, smoke swirling around it, golden eyes soft in the half-light. For a heartbeat, everything was still, just the three of them and the whisper of wind. Then the bobcat took one last step forward and pressed its head gently against her knee. And in that touch, Clara felt everything: forgiveness, gratitude, and something that felt like love. When Clara opened her eyes, the sky was no longer red. Smoke drifted thin across the hills, glowing with the weak gold of dawn. The air still smelled of ash, but the heat was gone. In its place came the sound of dripping water, melted snow finding its way home. She sat up slowly. The blanket around her was black with soot, the fabric singed and stiff. In her arms, The cub stirred, alive. Its fur was warm, its heart beat fast and fragile against her palm. "Hey," she whispered, voice rough. "We made it." The forest below was unrecognizable, black stumps and smoldering soil where life had been. Yet even there, beneath the ruin, she saw flickers of silver where snow still survived. The world was trying, already, to begin again. A rustle made her turn. The mother bobcat stood at the ridge's edge. Smoke curled around her like ghost light. Her body trembled with exhaustion, one paw dragged faintly behind. Yet her head was high, eyes clear and golden as sunrise. Clara froze, unable to move or speak. For a heartbeat, she thought she was imagining it, a trick of smoke and hope. But then the bobcat blinked, slow and deliberate, alive, real. She wanted to run to her, to wrap her in the blanket, to keep her safe from everything that burned. But the distance between them was sacred now, something neither could cross without breaking it. Clara knelt. The cub pressed against her chest. "She's here," she whispered softly. "She's okay." The bobcat took a step closer, then stopped. Her gaze drifted to the cub, and something shifted in the air, a tenderness that made Clara's throat ache. "You did it," Clara said. "You brought her back." The bobcat blinked again. Then, with a slow, graceful motion, she turned toward the trees that still stood beyond the burn. Her fur caught the light, gold on gray, fire turned to sun. Clara's tears came quietly, without sound. "Go," she said. "Go home." The bobcat hesitated once, looking back, not to confirm, not to ask, but to promise. Then she slipped into the smoke, her silhouette fading between the trunks until there was nothing left but light. Clara stayed there for a long time, holding the cub. She listened to the distant hum of helicopters, the voices of men calling through the ruins. But they were far away, another world entirely. Up here it was only her, the cub, and the slow return of silence. When the sun finally broke through the haze, she stood and began the long walk back to the cabin. The snow crunched under her boots, soft and clean. Behind her, the valley shimmered, a scar, yes, but also a beginning. And somewhere beyond the smoke, faint but certain, came a sound she would never forget. A single, wild cry, clear, fierce, alive. The valley slept beneath a shroud of mist. Weeks had passed since the fire, yet the air still carried the faint scent of smoke and wet earth. Ash clung to the trees like a second bark. The forest looked wounded, but not dead. Shoots of green already pierced the blackened soil, thin and stubborn. Clara watched from her porch, a cup of tea cooling between her hands. The cabin had survived, barely. The paint was blistered, the roof patched with tin, but it still stood. So did she, inside near the hearth. The cub was curled in a woven basket lined with old flannel. It had grown quickly, stronger, curious, unafraid. She called her Ember. The name felt right, a small flame that refused to die. Some mornings, Clara found the cub pawing at the window, eyes fixed on the tree line where the forest began again. Each time, her chest ached in that old, familiar way. "She'll come back for you," Clara whispered one day, tracing a finger along the glass. "Or maybe you'll go find her. Either way, you'll know where to look." She'd begun photographing again, not the way she used to, hunting for the perfect shot, but quietly, reverently. She captured what remained. Frost melting on a burned branch, sunlight catching a thread of spider silk between two charred trunks, Ember's paw prints in the soot. Each photo felt like an answer to a question she hadn't realized she'd been asking. At night, when the wind moved through the valley, Clara sometimes dreamed of the fire, not of the terror, but of the light. She saw the bobcat standing on the ridge, eyes bright, unbroken. She always woke with tears in her eyes, but they no longer burned. One evening, as twilight pooled across the snow, Jenkins stopped by. He brought wood, food, and an awkward silence that lingered between them until he said, "You did a brave thing, Clara." She smiled faintly. "No." She did. His gaze shifted to Ember, curled near the fire. "Looks like she left you a piece of herself," Clara nodded. "Maybe that's how the wild forgives us. Not with words, but with something new." Jenkins stayed for tea, then left before dark, boots crunching through the snow. His lantern bobbed away, swallowed by the mist. Clara closed the door and stood by the window for a long time. Outside, the forest breathed again. A light snow began to fall, soft and endless. She reached down, and Ember climbed into her arms, warm and alive. "See that?" Clara whispered. "The snow always comes back. So do we." The snow returned quietly, as if apologizing for the fire. It came one morning without warning, soft, fine, endless. The valley turned white again, hiding its scars beneath a new beginning. Clara stepped outside with her camera. The cold pinched her cheeks, but it felt good, real, honest. She hadn't carried the camera since the fire. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the lens. Ember followed her to the porch, tail flicking curiously at the falling flakes. The world was silent except for the faint creak of branches under snow. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called once, then was gone. She took her first photo of the season, a single tree standing in the middle of the burned clearing. Its trunk was blackened, split, but from its highest branch, a thin green shoot had begun to grow. The sight made her chest tighten. "Life's stubborn," she murmured, "just like her." Ember mewed softly, rubbing against her boot. Over the next days, she wandered farther, capturing the slow return of color, moss spreading on wet stone, deer tracks crossing the ash, sunlight bending through fog. Each image felt like a small resurrection. But the last photo came unexpectedly. It was early evening when she saw it, a streak of gold against the white moving near the edge of the trees. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. She raised her camera, heart pounding. Through the lens, she saw the outline clearly now. Lean, graceful, unmistakable. The bobcat. Older, thinner, but alive. It stood still for a moment, head lifted toward the light snow. Then it turned, eyes meeting hers across the clearing. The distance between them didn't matter. The look said everything words never could. Clara's hands shook as she pressed the shutter. The sound, that soft click, was like a heartbeat. When she lowered the camera, the bobcat was already gone, melted back into the trees. She stood there a long time, snow gathering on her hair and coat, camera clutched tight against her chest. Later, in the dim red glow of her small darkroom, she watched the image appear slowly on the paper. The shape of the cat emerged first, faint, ghost-like, framed by falling snow. Behind it, light spilled through the forest, turning the air into something sacred. Her throat tightened. She smiled through her tears. It was the most beautiful photograph she'd ever taken. When it dried, she wrote one line on the back before placing it beside the hearth. "For the ones who return, and for the ones who teach us how." Ember purred in her lap as the fire crackled low. Outside, snow kept falling, endless, forgiving, new. Morning came slow and silver, the kind of light that made the world look clean, as if forgiven. Clara woke to Ember pawing gently at her sleeve, eyes bright, restless. Outside, snow had fallen through the night, blanketing everything in a soft hush. She dressed quietly, layered scarf and coat, and opened the door. The cold met her like an old friend, sharp, alive, honest. Ember bounded into the snow, leaving tiny prints behind her, tail flicking with delight. Clara smiled. "Easy there, little one," she murmured, following. The forest beyond the clearing shimmered under the new sun. Smoke no longer haunted it. The air was pure again, carrying only the sound of melting frost dripping from the eaves. Every step Clara took made the faintest crunch, a rhythm of life returning. Halfway across the clearing, she stopped. There, beside the path, were tracks, larger than embers, older, fresh enough that the edges hadn't yet softened. Her breath caught. They were bobcat prints. They led from the tree line to the porch, circled once, then vanished into the woods again. Clara knelt, brushing snow from one of the paw marks with trembling fingers. For a long moment she just stared, her throat tightening with something she couldn't name. "She came back," she whispered, "just for a moment." Ember trotted up beside her, sniffing the print before looking up with curious eyes. Clara smiled through the tears blurring her vision. "She wanted to make sure you're all right," she said softly, "that we're both all right." The wind stirred then, carrying a faint echo through the pines, low, soft, wild, not a cry, more like a call, a sound that belonged to the world beyond human hands. Clara looked toward the forest, eyes glistening in the pale light. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than breath. Ember pressed close to her leg, warm against the cold. Together, they watched as the sunlight spread across the snow, catching on the prints until they glowed like tiny embers before fading away. She stayed there until the wind erased the last of them, until the forest stood still again. Then she turned toward home. Inside, she stoked the fire and hung the photograph above the mantel, the one of the golden cat in falling snow. The light from the flames made it shimmer, almost alive. She poured tea, sat by the window, and watched the snow drift down. Ember curled at her feet, purring softly. For the first time in years, Clara felt the world settle around her. Not silent, not lonely, but full. Outside, the forest waited. Quiet, patient, infinite, and somewhere within it, unseen but certain, a pair of golden eyes blinked once in the morning light. Before turning away, back into the wild. Spring arrived quietly, almost shy. The snow melted in thin streams that traced new paths through the valley, glimmering like silver threads. Patches of green broke through the ash, small but fierce. Life was coming back, not all at once, but faithfully, as if it had been waiting for permission. Clara sat on the porch, camera resting in her lap. Ember played nearby, leaping at the shadows of early butterflies. The cabin smelled of pine and wood smoke again, of home. She'd begun writing again, too. Not for magazines or exhibitions, but for herself. Notes about the forest, its moods, its silences. Some pages were about the fire. Some were about the bobcat. Most were about what she'd learned in the space between losing and finding again. She wrote, "The wild does not need us to save it. It only asks that we remember we belong to it." Sometimes, when dusk fell and the air turned blue, she thought she saw movement at the tree line, a flash of gold between the birches, quick and quiet. She never tried to follow. Some things are meant to remain mystery, and that was enough. The photograph she took that winter, the one of the bobcat standing in falling snow, now hung in a local gallery. People called it the promise. They said it made them feel peace or longing, or something they couldn't name. When asked about it, Clara only said, "It's not a picture of loss. It's a picture of return." The curator had offered to buy it, but she refused. Some stories shouldn't be owned. On the last evening before the thaw was complete, she took Ember for a walk along the ridge. The air smelled of wet moss and earth waking from sleep. At the edge of the woods, the cub stopped and looked out, ears twitching. Clara followed its gaze. There was nothing there, only light and wind and the soft rustle of leaves. But she smiled anyway. "Go on," she whispered. "You'll find her someday." Ember turned back once, eyes bright, before padding into the trees. Clara watched until the small form disappeared, swallowed by green. Then she turned toward the setting sun, its warmth brushing her face like a hand. For the first time, she didn't feel the ache of goodbye. She felt the quiet joy of everything that had led her here. The storm, the loss, the fire, the wild heart that had chosen to come back. Because maybe love, in its purest form, was never about keeping. It was about freeing, about recognizing something wild and choosing to let it remain that way. She lifted her camera one last time, framing the horizon where light met shadow. And before the shutter clicked, she whispered to the wind, to the forest, to the golden eyes that still lived in memory. Sometimes, the wildest creatures remind us what it truly means to be human.